Hello and welcome to CJJ's webinar on LGBT youth and juvenile justice, creating agency policies for an equitable system on the state and local level. My name is Jonathan Litt and I'm the Policy and Field Relations Associate at the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. Before I introduce today's distinguished speakers, I'd like to take a moment to discuss a few technical details. You will notice that all participants are and will remain muted throughout the webinar. Presenters will answer questions at the end of the presentation. You may submit your questions by typing your questions into the question box at any time throughout the webinar. You will also notice that there are two resources available for downloading under the Handouts menu in your control panel. You can click a resource to download. If you don't see the documents in your control panel, please click the plus sign next to Handouts to drop down this menu option. We are recording this webinar. The recording, PowerPoint presentation, handouts, and additional resources will be posted on CJJ's website within 24 hours. With that, it's my honor and privilege to welcome today's speakers, Christina Gilbert, Lisa Belmarsh, and Laura Garnett. Christina serves as the Equity Project Director, a collaborative initiative of the National Juvenile Defender Center, Legal Services for Children, and the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Prior to working for the Equity Project, Christina worked with a variety of juvenile justice advocacy organizations, addressing issues such as school discipline, restorative justice, disproportionate minority contact, and youth in the adult criminal justice system. She has also worked with international human rights and anti-discrimination organizations. Lisa serves as the Director for Policy and Training for the Massachusetts Department of Youth Services. It's within this role over the last 8 years that she's been able to focus on the best practices that juvenile justice agencies can utilize to help staff care for the youth within their agency. Lisa was part of the DYS Policy Working Group, who received the 2015 Commonwealth Equity and Governance Award from Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker this fall, recognizing the policy and training work for the LGBTQI GNC youth and DYS care. She was also part of the National Institute of Corrections Working Group, who collaborated to create respectful communication for LGBTQ youth, a course that provides strategies for communicating effectively and professionally with all youth, with a specific focus on LGBTQI youth. Laura serves as the Chief Probation Officer for the Santa Clara County Probation Department. In this role, she led a team in creating one of 2 model sites in the country to confidently serve lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth in the juvenile justice system. She previously served as the Director of Juvenile Probation, Juvenile Hall, and Adult Probation in Santa Cruz County, California, where she was central in moving Santa Cruz County to a national model for the Annie Casey Foundation's Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, or JDI. She has extensive experience in program development, implementation, and evaluation, and has authored and implemented many successful grants throughout the state, federal, and private funders. And with that, it's my distinguished honor to turn it over to Christina.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jonathan. As Jonathan said, I'm the Director of the Equity Project. We're here talking today about creating agency policies for an equitable system, and you're going to hear from 2 experts in the field, one in Massachusetts, one in Santa Clara County, about really practical examples of how they did it in their jurisdictions. And so I'm just here to provide a brief overview of a few other related issues to developing agency policy, and to also hopefully provide some additional tools and resources. And I know we have very limited time. A number of the resources I'm going to mention are on the Equity Project website as well, www.equityproject.org. Next slide, please, Jonathan. So even though we're talking primarily about creating agency policy, policy doesn't happen in a vacuum. So these are the 4 core components I see in creating systemic change pertaining to policies for LGBT youth in the juvenile justice system. They include policy, data management, training, and leadership. And so we will get into all of those. And I know we've had other webinars where we've talked a lot about training, but you really can't have one without the other. Next slide, please. And why? Why are we talking about LGBT youth in the juvenile justice system. As many of you probably know, approximately 20% of youth in juvenile detention self-identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or gender nonconforming, and that's compared to approximately 5 to 7% in the general population, so not in the juvenile justice system. That's pretty significant disproportionality. The data also show LGBT youth are more likely to enter juvenile detention for low-level offenses such as running away, truancy, violations of probation. They also experience unique issues and experience discrimination once they are detained. And like most youth in the juvenile justice system, these 20% in detention are primarily youth of color. Next slide. So these are just highlights. You're going to hear a lot about Santa Clara and Massachusetts, about their policies, which are two of probably the best in the country. But just so you know, there are other models out there. Some are better than others. This is not a comprehensive list. There are probably others I'm unaware of. But these are a number of other jurisdictions, all their policies that have LGBT juvenile justice policies, and they're all available on the Equity Project website to give you something to look at. Next slide. And in addition to the policies, if you really want to engage in those 4 pieces of systemic reform, we have another tool that was based on the Equity Project work in both Santa Clara County, California, and in Louisiana, where we learned really there is no one model for reform because every jurisdiction looks different, but there are some similarities and some key resources and tools really related to stakeholder collaboration, training, and policy. And so we have put together this toolkit, which is available on our website as well. Next slide. And then the resource I just wanted to mention again around training is that there's a comprehensive training curriculum developed with the input of experts in the field, our Equity Project Advisory Committee, designed specifically for juvenile justice professionals working with LGBT youth. Next slide. It's a 6-lesson comprehensive training curriculum, and it's all available publicly, and you can reach out to the Equity Project for additional information. Next slide. So speaking of that, I'm not going to go into huge detail on terminology. As you just saw on our training curriculum, lesson 1 is entirely dedicated to terminology. I think it's about 2 hours. I'm going to spend about 1 minute just so we have some common language. At the top of this slide, you'll see the term SOGI, which is an acronym that stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, just because that's a mouthful to say all over and over and over again. And so these are the issues, the terminology and concepts that we're discussing. And then the arrows below identify sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. And you can see from this chart that these are all 4 separate pieces of identity. And each one of them, there is a range. People fall on a spectrum, and everyone has all of these things. It's a piece of all of our identity, LGBT or not. Sexual orientation, the bottom arrow, sexual orientation is about who you're attracted to. And then gender expression, moving up, is about how you convey your gender to the rest of the world, so things like clothing. Gender identity is your internal psychological sense of self. And the sex that's assigned at birth, really all that is the doctor looking at your genitals and saying this is what you are. So like I said, we could spend hours on terminology, but hopefully having that. And then LGBT, I don't think I've just been saying that. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and there are a number of other terms that we could be inclusive of, that we try to be inclusive of, but just to be a little bit briefer, we're going to use those acronyms throughout. Next slide. So creating agency policy, so why is this important? Well, one of the main reasons is that all youth in the juvenile, including youth who are incarcerated, have rights. They have the right to be free from physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, the right to be free from unreasonably restrictive confinement, to adequate medical and mental health care, to equal protection under the law, and to freedom of speech and expression. And you'll hear later about how these policies can really help protect those rights. Next slide. And in addition to the policies, there are a number of tools that help protect those rights. So the Constitution, federal statutes and regulations, for example, PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and the Juvenile Justice Facility Standards, the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, case law. RG versus Kohler is a very important federal case regarding LGBT youth in custody in Hawaii that everyone should be aware of, and professional standards in state and local policy. And that's what we're really going to talk about here. And I just want to encourage people that even in jurisdictions where there may not be protections at the state or local level, there might not be state laws that protect sexual orientation, gender identity, there still are national professional standards of care, and I think you can really look to those and to best practices and models in creating agency policy and really creating equitable and respectful treatment for LGBT youth in the system. Next slide. And these are just a couple of examples about the professional standards of care that are out there. I think they're all linked to on the PowerPoint, so you can review those on your own. Those are just that's not comprehensive. There are a number of others as well, but major medical and mental health organizations. Next slide. Which include explicit statements against reparative and conversion therapy, and these are just an example of the types of organizations which have said that reparative or conversion therapy, also known as sexual orientation change efforts, are ineffective and harmful, and really it's just important to note that every major medical and mental health organization has said this. And so with that, I know that was very quick, just a brief overview, but I just wanted to encompass some of the other issues and highlight some of the why, and I'll turn it over to Lisa and then Laura so you can hear some really specific examples about how they did it in their jurisdiction.
Great, thank you, Christina. I'm Lisa Belmarsh. I am the Director of Policy and Training for the Massachusetts Department of Youth Services. We in Massachusetts are responsible for the care and custody of all juveniles who are committed in Massachusetts on criminal offenses. Christina just talked about the major components in this area. So as she said, I'll be delving into those components and tell you just how we actually developed our policy on LGBTQI GNC youth. Next slide, please. In July of 2014, we implemented a policy on the prevention of discrimination and harassment of youth. This policy also included a guideline attached to it for LGBTQI GNC youth. The guidelines in the policy provided direction for staff to how to ask youth how they identify during intake procedures, how then to place those youth, and some of the operational practices that are important to talk about with youth, including those that identify as LGBTQI or DNC. So again, I'm going to get into more specific ways that we actually got to this place in July of 2014 and ultimately the training on this policy. Next slide, please. So I call this presentation a recipe for change. I like to relate policymaking to cake baking because, frankly, I feel policy writing can be really boring, and cakes are much more fun. So I try and add some real-life instances or an example of how we get through this process. Creating policy can work well if you follow certain steps, similar to following a recipe. As Christina said earlier, there's no one way to get this done. Similarly, there's no one way to bake a cake. But we all have to have basically the same ingredients in order to get to a good result. If our policy was a cake, I would say it looks something like this. It looks pretty good. All the ingredients are there. We followed a good recipe. Pieces are in place. The frosting's on. From one side, maybe another, if we push it against a wall or in between some other desserts, we might even get away with it being completely done. Right now, I could actually say we're done with it and be happy that the frosting actually made it onto the cake rather than being eaten by a spoon. Next slide, please. But I don't really consider our policy completely done. In fact, I've learned that a policy is done for about 30 minutes after you've signed it, and then by that time, someone's already asking for something in it to be changed. So I like to think of our policy somewhere in between these, hopefully more to the right than the left. Next slide, please. So policy, you need a dessert for 10 or you need an outcome for your agency. You need to gather the right ingredients or for policy making the right people to get it done. You have to make sure that you put the ingredients together just so in order for it to be edible. In policy making, you need to mix together a draft and then stir it around for a while until it actually feels good for your agency. Once you get your policy or your cake all done, more often than not, it still needs something. It needs a tweak or a little bit more or less of something. It can be done even without the frosting or details, but if you really want it to be special and you want it to work for you, you keep at it and you keep working on it until time and time again until you finally get it to where you want it. So this analogy really does help me keep on track with policies. I find that if I follow a set plan, if I have told people what that plan is and communicated it well, we actually do get things done. Next slide, please. Before you start any policy or any type of direction that you're trying to go in, I do find there are a few things that are important. First, you really need to set intention. For this, we found we needed to set a really big intention. We needed it to be an agency priority from the top down. The commissioner had to actually say, I want this done, and I want everyone to work on it. Or as Marie Antoinette at one point says, let them eat cake. But if it's not the commissioner for your location, then start from where you are. You could start as the program director, the shift supervisor, the clinical supervisor. Wherever you are, you can take some of these steps and get something really strong implemented for the youth in your care. Next slide, please. One of the other important factors before getting started was figuring out who's in charge. Honestly, this was my job. I was the taskmaster. I kept people going on task, and I revised drafts, researched, communicated, kept everyone trying to move into the same direction. Your leadership can come from many different levels. It can come from the most senior commissioner, the chief of probation. It can also come from internal changes from the program director, from someone who's working the shift. Start from the highest place where you can, but don't let the fact that you can't get higher stop you from acting. You can still do this no matter where you are. I do think that sometimes too many cooks in the kitchen do create chaos. So you really need to think about who is the one person that's going to have being the taskmaster as their responsibility. I didn't make all the decisions, but I controlled the process. And I kept people at the table, I set deadlines, and I moved the discussion. There were a lot of cooks, as you can see from around this picture. They were the experts in their subjects. They were the clinical directors, the health directors, the operational directors. Find your super fans, those that you know will believe in this and that will keep this on their to-do list. For Massachusetts, we had the commissioner, we had our regional directors, we had our senior staff committed to this topic, which actually made this possible. So find them, and you will succeed in moving this forward. Next slide.
Lisa, did you want to launch the poll here?
Yes, we do have our first polling question, if you'd like to put that up, Jonathan. Thank you. So this is a polling question that you can take a moment to answer. I'll read it. The policies and practices can stem from leadership at the following levels. And please choose Commissioner of the agency and judicial officers, Program Director. You can select all that apply. Senior staff of the County Juvenile Corrections, Monitor of Juvenile Facilities, Clinical Supervisor. Jonathan, I'll let you tell me when you're ready to move forward.
Yep, we're about at 50% response rate right now, so we'll give folks a couple more seconds to respond to the poll here.
Great. So as you can see, the point of this polling question was to show that, no matter how you relate to any of these categories, really it can start from anywhere. So I think that is applicable in the answers. So good job. So moving forward.
Bear with me for a second. I'll find our spot again.
I think we want to be on slide 20, Jonathan. Great. Great. So getting back to the list of steps of the process, we have to decide what is the outcome that we're looking for as you get started. When we started at DYS, we were at the executive level. We really didn't know where we wanted to go with this. We were very new to the process. We didn't know what we knew. We didn't know a lot. That was pretty much the most common thing we knew. And we didn't have a lot of the resources that have now become available in the last couple of years. So we started very vague. We knew we needed to have better practices for LGBTQI GNC youth. And honestly, that's the statement that we started with, and we just started to break it down from that level. Somehow we also needed to try and figure out how we were going to get this topic on everybody's agenda. How were we going to make sure everyone had this as their priority? And so we used a number of vehicles in order to do this. And it was important to do that because then we felt that everyone who was part of the process was actually accomplishing something that had to get done. And everyone knows competing demands are very hard to get around. So this kept everyone focused and moving forward. Next slide. So how do you get it onto everyone's working plan? Christina talked earlier about tools that were available to you. So most likely if you're involved in juvenile justice, you know that there's a number of state laws, federal laws, PREA, agency goals that you have that a lot of your partners within the criminal justice system or within your own agency also have to comply with. So there are a number of categories, and I've listed them here, of places where you can go to get it on everyone's working plan. For us, we knew that we wanted to have all staff to get this information. So we knew that we needed input from all of our senior directors to review their piece of that information. And next slide.
Do you want to do our next poll, Lisa?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm relying on you, Jonathan, to tell me when they are. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
So our next polling question is, here in front of you, creating LGBTQ policies will allow you to be compliant with the following laws and standards. Again, please select the one that you think is the one that you think applies. So it's PREA, state constitutions, criminal statutes, all of the above, or just A and B.
So we'll give folks a couple more seconds to respond to the poll here.
Mm-hmm. Great. Perfect. So definitely PREA, definitely state constitutions, A and B are definitely your answers. There might be some criminal statutes that you could also fit in. It probably would depend on your jurisdictions, but clearly there are a number of places where you can go to put this on your radar and say this is why we have to try and implement better practices. Okay, moving on. So how will you then, once everyone you've determined who your players are going to be, how can we get, with everybody having varied responsibilities, the ability to get everybody focused? So think about your time frame. We had a party date, or as other people call it, a PREA audit date. But again, party sounds better, right? We started this implementation or this drafting way back in the summer of 2013. We knew we had to have a training completed for spring of 2014, which was when an audit date was going to occur. We then worked backwards. Our prep time we used to research and draft and do any sort of tweaks to our final draft. Our cook time was what we used for training our staff until it was ultimately implemented. And we actually set our policy implementation date until after all the training was anticipated to be completed so that staff felt that they weren't already in violation of the policy before they had received any training on it. And next. We started our drafting or mixing our results by researching best practices. You are more than welcome to steal and use ours. We also used some from the Boston Police Department, from our Department of Early and Secondary Education that had an excellent guidance on LGBTQ youth in public schools. We also looked to other states, similar to what Christina has also referenced at these on the sites earlier in the presentation. In addition, the professional standards that Christina referenced offer you really strong recommendations on how to get over difficult places in your development. So you're not going to know how to respond to certain areas. Those professional standards can give you the best practice to help you over those places. And next. I like to think that scratch isn't always best. Sometimes it is easier to go with a boxed mix. So if you choose this route, again, find a draft, use ours. Research will then help you find a boilerplate that you have in order to at least start the discussion. We started with New York. When we first started it and we looked at New York's policy, we thought there was no way that we were going to be able to actually do everything that they did. It seemed very overwhelming the first time we looked at it. But then having this draft in front of us really helped us stay on target, kept us moving, and I like to say that, you know, we're at least where New York is, and we actually enhanced, I think, some of the practices as we went forward in our own draft. Next. Our ingredients included our senior managers. They included our directors of clinical, health services, victims, legal representation, regional directors, other representatives that we pulled in depending on what topic we were looking to discuss, for example, placement or clinical or medical or mental health. We would meet as a group and develop the draft and kind of set our meeting schedule based on that. We then pulled in our consultants. We called them our secret ingredients. Especially if you've never used this recipe, you know, that it was nice to have someone who sort of led us through the sticking points. They got us through the bumps, they educated us, they made us think of things that we would never have contemplated within our own group and made us kind of exercise some out-of-the-box thinking. And finally, we did commit to a very difficult schedule. We held over 10 meetings in the course of one summer, which all lasted at least 2 to 3 hours. So it was a lot of work and a lot of back and forth. And next. We continued in developing drafts. A key piece of us developing this draft was to make it applicable to all youth, which is why we went with a policy against all harassment and discrimination. We then focused on the specifics of LGBTQ. We created a policy on the grievance process, which applied to all youth. And then all youth were then notified of their protections through educational materials given to youth at intake, and available through the residential programs such as books, posters, and handouts. Next slide. Highlights from the guideline on LGBTQI GNC youth included the topics that are listed here. I'm not going to go through them. Laura actually is going to go through them in more detail on her presentation when she comes up after me. But we really tried to focus on what the best practice was for all youth, and then got into more specifics on how it related to an LGBTQ youth within our custody. And I believe there's a polling question again. So the poll is topics that LGBTQ policies address to make locations safer include, and you can choose from the following: right to freedom of speech, right to adequate mental and health care, the right to vote, all of the above, or just A and B.
We'll give everybody a couple more seconds to respond to the poll.
Great. Great. So again, the topics that we focused on were three of the ones anyway, were the freedom of speech and adequate mental health and health care. I'm sure right to vote could have something in there, but we didn't quite focus on that right specifically. So A and B was probably your best choice. And next slide. So finally, it was time to bake. We mixed it all up, we threw it in a pan, and we needed time to be able to make it somewhat edible, I guess is the right word for this project, this time. We had a training model that we've tried to use in a number of areas. We trained our senior staff first. We then trained our supervisors and our managers. And then we picked standalone programs and in our audit sites to go first, since they were going to actually need the information quicker than others. We trained on what LGBTQ means and the competencies that are associated with LGBTQ. And then part of that training also included our own specific policy. We used our own trainer for DOIS policy and our consultant, Mrs. Servant with Maybright Incorporated, for the LGBTQ competencies. At every training, we kept moving and offering this model over and over again until we trained over 2,000 employees. And we also still have continuous training. All of our current staff has been trained, and then we keep this model available, or this module available for new staff that come to our basic training each month. And there's one more polling question, I believe. A training program should start with the following group of people, and pick your best answer.
We'll give everybody a couple more seconds to respond.
Great. So yeah, the right answer for me anyway was senior staff and directors. I think that it's important to train your higher level staff first so that they know what their staff is going to be getting. It also allowed us to really get some input from the senior staff and from those directors on things that were in the policy that might just not work for them, and gave us some opportunity to go back and have a shorter discussion before we did roll it out to all of our direct care staff. So good job. So next slide. We did have some sticking points when we thought we were ready to serve it up. We did hit a few places that didn't go over as smoothly as we thought they would. Primarily it was because it did take so long time from starting this draft to actually getting it to training and implementation. We forgot that this was a new subject for a lot of people and how far we had actually come in our own thinking. So some staff, when we rolled this out, did have a hard time. The comments were hard to hear. We had to go back with our trainers and really work with them on coming up with some other ideas on how to present it. And some staff just needed some more support from their supervisors to ask more questions and figure out how they were going to resolve some of their own personal issues when it came to talking about LGBTQ identifications for the youth that they were supervising. The next steps that we knew we hadn't gotten to yet, but we didn't want it to stop the process. We wanted to make sure that we had in our plan going forward that we were going to still collect data, that we were going to complete an evaluation. We were going to incorporate these practices within our electronic management system so everything was not on paper. And we also want to get to use the same education that we're actually providing for our staff. And so we have gotten, I'll go to the next slide. There actually was 2 other slides, but they might not have gotten into the final presentation. So I can just talk briefly. We did do an evaluation from this policy. Once we had trained most of our staff, 3 months after the initial policy and initial training was complete, we found that overwhelmingly staff felt better about reporting incidents. We asked them a question: if youth were harassed or discriminated against because of an actual or perceived LGBTQI or GNC status, staff overwhelmingly agreed that they would feel more comfortable now reporting the incident. In the same token, we asked them in their own unit, did youth know how to report events and concerns about their care and their treatment through the youth grievance process, or by telling an employee, or verbally or in writing? And again, overwhelmingly, staff said that they felt youth could use their knowledge to now feel better about how to report and were more knowledgeable in how to report. So I guess the moral of the story was that this process not only helped us learn about a new subject for a lot of people, but it also really did make our location safer for not just youth but also staff, and did have a very positive effect. So with that, I will move on and let Laura Garnett talk about her part.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon. This is Laura Garnett. I'm the Chief Probation Officer in Santa Clara County, California, which is the Silicon Valley area, and with San Jose is the seat of the county. We're a county-run model. The probation departments in California are operated independently with obviously some state oversight, but we're not a statewide system, so each county develops their own policies and procedures. Our department has just under 1,000 employees, and we operate 2 juvenile detention facilities. Next slide. So Christina talked a little bit about this, but I'm going to just touch on it from my vantage point about why are we doing a webinar on LGBT youth on the national level. Mainly because we have a lot of these kids in our system and they're grossly underestimated. So Dr. Angela Irvine's work that Christina referred to, the latest version produced in 2014, shows that 20% of youth in juvenile detention facilities, and this is by self-disclosure, so we can only assume that this is underreported, not overreported, self-identify as either lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or gender nonconforming. That's 1 in 5 youth that we're working with in our facilities. Obviously, we're already working with this population, even if we don't know or if our staff don't know, and it's our responsibility to protect their rights, and hopefully after this you'll have a little bit more information about some of the best practices. Next slide, please. There's 2 ways to develop policies and procedures in your area. One's to be proactive, one's to be reactive. We were kind of in between. We did have not necessarily crisis. We had a transgender young woman in custody who was housed on the wrong unit and had to quickly mobilize and figure out what to do. At the time, we had a chief of probation named Sheila Mitchell who was very visionary and acted very quickly upon learning this, and we met with county council immediately. And so attached to, on this webinar, you can see the full county council opinion, which I strongly encourage you to download and read and keep, because that's really the cornerstone of our work. Next slide, please. So this is one of my favorite leadership quotes by Rosalind Carter. A leader takes people where they want to go. A great leader takes people where they don't necessarily want to go, but ought to be. And this is certainly an issue similar to disproportionality and other issues that make people really nervous and uncomfortable, that you need to stand out in front of this and take a stand. Next slide, please. So that's just the copy of the, that's the front page of the county council memo I just referenced. This was done from the time of alerting county council that we needed an opinion on this, and the time that we had an opinion that we could use was, I don't think, any more than a couple of weeks. They did a stellar job, and again, it's a very strong opinion and the cornerstone of our policies. Having said that, I also want to say that our agency, our full-on agency policy that covers all LGBT youth, and our juvenile hall policy specific to housing and care of transgender youth and transgender preference form will all be available on both the Equity site and the CJJ site by tomorrow. Next slide, please. So similar to what Lisa said, but without the really cute pictures that she has, here's the ingredients for success, or at least the way we see them. You've got to have leadership at all levels, so it's not just leadership at the top. You have to have the leadership, the elected officials, the department heads, but you need leadership among your line staff, supervisors, managers, and stakeholders as well, because this has to be an issue that people understand and understand the data around it, not just opinion. This isn't something that can be, you can't craft good policies and procedures when you let people's just personal opinions get in the way. So knowing the research, the current research, learning best practices, understanding what the experts are guiding us to do, and then train, modeling, and coaching is essential. Next slide, please. And this is just to show this issue, just like any other issue that we work on, should be data-driven and relying on best practices. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do you have to understand before you get moving on this? You've got to know your political climate and how to navigate that. You've got to know your state and federal mandates. You've got to know what the professionals are saying, and you've got to know when they change what they're saying, so you've got to be up to date on that. You can't read it once and not look at it again for 3 years. You need to understand the impact of what you're doing on LGBT youth and on other youth that are not LGBT. You need to understand your questions and concerns as staff and be responsive to those, and never underestimate navigating family input. That was an area that we did underestimate and ended up having to kind of hurriedly shore that up. Next slide, please. So here's what you're likely to hear versus what the truth is. Next slide. Often we hear that youth are too young to know if they're lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And in fact, we know that gender identity and sexual orientation are often established as early as 3 to 5 years of age. And these are based on thoughts and emotions, not necessarily sexual encounters. Next slide. We'll also hear that youth can choose not to be LGBT. It's clear from all of the major medical groups and psychiatric groups that gender identity and sexual orientation are immutable aspects of identity, and that trying to change them is not only futile but harmful to youth. All major medical and behavioral health organizations condemn reparative therapy as harmful. Next slide, please. This is a quote from the American Medical Association, that scientific data suggests that personal choice has little or no influence on determining a person's sexual orientation. This is oftentimes comforting for staff to understand that this isn't just what somebody's making up, but that these are areas that have been soundly researched. Next slide. The American Psychiatric Association recommends that ethical practitioners refrain from attempts to change individual sexual orientation, keeping in mind the medical dictum to first do no harm. Next slide. Another thing we hear often is transgender youth are just acting out or seeking attention. Why can't they just act the way they're supposed to while they're in here so we don't have to deal with this? But in fact, the medical research is very clear that the way to treat transgender youth is to let them express their core gender identity, not their birth gender, their birth sex. Next slide. And in fact, they say it very, very strongly. Both AMA and APA and other national experts say appropriate medical intervention for a transgender individual is to help them bring their physical body more in line with their internal gender identification. Further treatment is not cosmetic or experimental, but medically necessary. So if you would not debate with a doctor whether or not to give insulin to a diabetic, nor should you be debating with a doctor about whether or not to give hormonal treatment to a transgender youth or allowing them to be called by their chosen name or pronoun. Next slide, please. LGBT youth are mentally ill or abnormal. Hopefully we're beyond that in 2015 and don't need to discuss this, but it's clearly not a mental illness. There's no connection to predatory conduct. There's no correlation to sexual abuse, and it's clearly a normal aspect of human experience and identity across the world. Next slide, please. Again, this is the APA recommends to avoid doing anything to try to change sexual orientation, and instead advises to seek appropriate social and psychological support and educational services. So that means the kid's usually fine, and it's up to us to create the supports to let them know that they're fine. instead of to pathologize their identity. Next slide. And these youth have families, and those of us that work in juvenile justice know that families are oftentimes one of the areas you've got to put a whole lot of focus in. I actually did have a very cute picture of the Simpsons in here, but Jonathan took it out due to copyright infringement, so my one cute slide got moved. Sorry about that. Next slide. But this is what we can do to help families. This is Dr. Caitlin Ryan's research on family rejection and acceptance and what the outcomes for LGBT youth are based on families' rejection or acceptance. If a family has rejecting behavior of their child, and that can just be, you know, we think you're going to go to hell. It's not necessarily we're throwing you out of the house. It could be just somewhat rejecting behavior, like we just don't like you that way. These youth are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide, 6 times more likely to have high levels of depression, 3.5 times more likely to use illegal drugs, and have unprotected sex. So when we're talking to families and they're freaking out about their child, this is what we need to say. You can freak out about your child, but if you behave in this way, these are the likely outcomes. This is what we know. Next slide, please. And then better, we can say, and this is what you can do to help, which means we need to meet families where they are, and we need to make resources available to them. So we've got to have the support and guidance. We have to have the data ourselves. Our staff have to have it at their fingertips when families are coming to visit. And we need to have counseling. We need to have our services aligned with our policies and procedures so that when we say this is where you get help, we actually can make that happen. Supporting youth connections to extended families is really important because during this time of deep turmoil in families, a lot of times a youth can go live with a different family member while they work through it. Next slide. So just a couple more slides specific to detention, and then we'll jump to questions. So LGBT youth are absolutely more likely to be detained in our system, and there's various reasons for this. I won't read the slide, but you can kind of see what the drivers are, and then how those drivers turn into behaviors, and that behavior is what pushes youth into the juvenile justice system. So if you notice, those are all the top drivers of getting youth into detention and then having them not be able to get out. Next slide, please. Once they're detained, is what we know is that they experience high levels of harassment. They're often isolated. They're pathologized, criminalized. It's not a good place to be. It's not a good place to be for any youth. It's a horrible place to be for an LGBT youth. Next slide, please. If that wasn't bad enough, the 2010 DOJ report shows that 12.5% of youth with a sexual orientation other than heterosexual reported sexual victimization by other youth compared to 1.3% of their heterosexual coparts. That statistic alone should be enough to make people act, I would hope. Next slide, please. So we're responsible for all youth in detention to provide them physical and emotional safety and adequate and appropriate medical and mental health care, and prohibit arbitrary isolation and unreasonably restrictive conditions, and provide fair and non-discriminatory treatment. But those are just words. Next slide. If you can't then just take that and operationalize it into what that means for LGBT youth. Next slide. So what it means for LGBT youth is it's our responsibility to provide the physical and emotional safety and make sure that the environment that the youth are residing in is as safe as possible. That includes responding promptly to incidences, knowing the risk, having adequate supervision, having adequate staff and adequately trained staff, and a zero tolerance for any type of slurs or discriminatory language or behavior. Next slide. Expressions of gender identity, transgender and gender nonconforming youth should be allowed to address in the manner that they feel most comfortable. So if you have boy clothes and girls clothes in your institution and you have a transgender boy who wants to wear the boy's clothes, the transgender boy should be wearing the boy's clothes. Next, and having the name and pronoun of their choice. Next slide, please. So in most cases, it's appropriate to house youth according to their gender identity, not their birth gender, even in institutions that are so binary and or girl, boy, male, female. Sometimes youth don't feel comfortable being in the unit that responds to their gender identity, and that's okay too, but just make sure you realize that it's your job to make sure that their safety is ensured and that can't be part of their decision. It can't be you can be on that unit, but you're going to be isolated, and we hope you don't get hurt. It's your job to make sure that whichever decision they make, that their safety's paramount. Next slide. Again, equal application of rules and policies is important. A lot of times, same gender experimentation gets criminalized when, if it were opposite gender, it doesn't. That's something to look at. Making sure that religious programming isn't condemning LGBT youth is really important, but not just religious programming, any programming that comes in. Next slide. And creating a safe space. This is, from just like you do with anything else. This isn't something that you avoid. Take it head on. Talk to your staff about it. Talk to our stakeholders. Talk to the people around you. Let people know why you're making the decisions that you're making and stand behind them and feel comfortable about them. Don't participate in gossip. Don't make slanderous comments. Don't let other people do that around you. And most of all, be a role model and a leader. Next slide. Oh, that was it. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. So we'll be taking questions from participants at this time. You can type in your questions into the questions box if you haven't already done so. We'll wait a few minutes for questions to be entered. As you think about your questions, I just wanted to remind everybody that the recorded webinar, PowerPoint, handouts, and the additional resources referenced during the presentation will be posted on CJJ's website within the next 24 hours. So we'll start with one question for you, Laura. Lisa talked about some of the sticking points that Massachusetts experienced in their development and implementation of their policies. What were some of the sticking points that Santa Clara County experienced?
I would say overall we didn't have extreme sticking points. I think because we started doing this work intensively while we had a youth in custody. Really the hard part was managing that while everything we were doing was directly affecting our staff and the youth and the other youth at the same time. That ended up just being really difficult. That's why I would strongly advise not getting into that position. There were definitely sticking points with staff. So for example, our transgender preference form asked the youth which gender staff that they would prefer to have search them or urine test them. And so we had a couple of staff that just flat said, I won't do that. I won't search someone who's anatomically different than me. That's why I wanted, I only got one thing I got to put on the actual webinar was the county council opinion, because our county council very, very clearly said, you're an employee of this county, and if you're an employee of this county, you will do as directed, and as directed is the youth gets to decide. And so, even that was a sticking point for a very, very brief amount of time, and then we had the attorney in the room saying, no, the liability, because they were like, well, it's the liability on us, and she was very clear, no, the liability is on you if you go against our county policy. Otherwise, you're protected. So other than that, it was just a lot of work, like Lisa said.
All right, thanks, Laura. So this is a question regarding confidentiality and the disclosure of the self-disclosure by the youth. So if the young person does not want their family to know their gender expression or gender identity, what types of protections do you provide, if any?
Was that for anybody?
Yeah, anybody can jump in for that.
Okay, I'll jump in on that. That's actually referenced specifically in our policy, where we, and again, those policies are available online, where we ask the youth if it's okay to disclose or not to disclose. If it's not okay to disclose, then we don't put it in a court report. We don't discuss it with their families. We do spend time trying to empower the youth, because that's also a hard secret to keep, so we spend time trying to find a way that might be a safer way to let their family know. But if they still don't want to do that, then we fully respect that.
And this is Lisa. Very similar response. It is part of our policy and our guidelines. It's also part of the intake questions that we ask. And we obviously have to balance that with if a youth wants to be placed according to their gender identity, and if their family does not know, we have to tell the youth that you have to think about that, because if it may once they do get placed in that location, it may be pretty obvious how they are identifying. So again, we work with the youth, take their concerns into consideration, obviously, and then help with that, how best to handle that information with them.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next question is regarding really youth engagement or partnership, and that is, was input from LGBTQ youth gathered when developing the policies as well as family members?
So I can answer first. We did not have a strong process for including youth engagement or family participation, and that's one piece that is going back 3 years. If I could have included more, we would have done so. We are looking forward to creating a youth education around this topic, and so we've already incorporated a plan for how to bring youth to the table and have a focus group that includes them, and also developing ways to have family engagement within that development of that curriculum, as well as any additions to the policy. So we did not, but we're looking to include that in our next phase.
And in Santa Clara, we did. Dr. Irvine's research, obviously Dr. Ryan's research is, was interviewing the youth. Dr. Irvine's research, she also did a lot of focus groups in designing the surveys. And in addition, we had at least 2 youth that we had on contract that we worked with while we were developing our policies that we still work with for training.
Thanks, everybody. And I think we have time for maybe one last question, and that is, given everything that's been discussed today, I imagine that there would be a lot of pushback from staff and other individuals who are involved in policy decision-making. So how, do you guys have any suggestions or recommendations on how to make this policy kind of filter to the top and really build and champion leaders to kind of carry the flag going forward?
I can. This is Lisa. Sorry, I know we don't know who should start. So this is Lisa. We found that, making sure, I said, having your super fans, so finding the people who are committed to this issue, who will be advocates for this issue, including them in your rollout, including them in your drafting of your policy, making sure that they are in the meetings, talking with people. Consultants were a huge resource to us. If someone had a question or was pushing back on a particular issue, I could reach out, or I could do some research on that issue and show the best practice. So even within training, we had some pushback from staff. Helping with that, we had our senior staff in the room during that training to help people realize that this wasn't going away, that people could be very open and ask questions and be honest, but that we all had to come to a understanding that this was the way it was going to come. But finding those people who are committed to this issue and making sure that they are involved in the process along the whole way.
Laura, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say, we really didn't have much pushback. I mean, a little pushback, and you have a little pushback with everything. But again, factual, data-driven. This isn't personal. Having the legal opinion behind you. Our county counsel was there right by our side as we rolled this out. And again, this isn't about your personal opinion. This is about what the experts say is the right thing to do for this population, and so that's what we're going to do. And I find the more we focus just on that and take out the other part, that our staff have been, fully engaged and on board and do a stellar job.
All right. So I want to thank our presenters today. If you'd like to follow up about the content that was discussed on today's webinar, please feel free to reach out to Christina Gilbert at the contact information listed there. If you require a certificate of completion for this webinar, or you'd like to hear about future CJJ webinars, please feel free to email me at lit@juvjustice.org. That concludes today's webinar. Thanks everybody for joining us. Our next webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, November 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll discuss human trafficking responses at the state and local level. We hope you'll join us again for future CJJ webinars. Have a great day, everybody.